Hey everyone, welcome to the AGC with Gianna Cutaia, also known as the Athlete Group Chat. I'm very excited to announce this podcast and the first episode being Meet the Host, me. So, on this first episode, we are going to be learning who I am, what this podcast is about, and why I decided to start this podcast. So let's get started. To start off, I am a junior at Penn State, and I'm also on the women's lacrosse team here. I'm majoring in broadcast journalism with a minor in sports studies, and my dream job is to be a sideline reporter for a big network like ESPN or Fox Sports. So now let's get into what is the AGC. So the AGC is a place for student athletes to tell their stories. It may be some serious topics like mental health, but it also may be like fun stories of like cool NIL deals that some athletes have, because like who doesn't want to hear about the crazy NIL deals that athletes are getting nowadays? Or it might be just them telling their story about who they are outside of their prospective sport. What's very different about this podcast is that I'm bringing on athletes that aren't the star of their team. Yes, some athletes may be the star of their team that come on this podcast, but my goal is to talk to athletes that have a unique story and like do things that are really cool and interesting outside of their prospective sport. And my biggest emphasis is going to be that everyone has a story, and it is important to know that because student athletes are much more than just an athlete. Now, getting into why I decided to start this podcast. I have been dabbling with the idea to start this podcast for a while now, but like never had the courage to do so. Never thought I had the time to do so. But here we are now doing it. So I'm very excited to be saying that. I also wanted to start this podcast based off of my own personal story. I have endured a lot of injuries over my athletic career. So I have a broad perspective of like what athletes go through. Also, I'm super involved with campus organizations on top of being an athlete here at Penn State, that I feel like I have a greater lens to what athletes go through and like what other athletes want, like what other athletes do outside of their prospective sports. So like that's why I wanted to start this podcast, is because I feel like I can relate to a lot of people in the terms of those areas. And I also have to give a huge, huge shout out to Penn State alum Hannah Mears. This past January, I was very lucky and was invited through an organization that I'm a part of, Awesome, Association for Women in Sports Media. If your campus has a chapter of Awesome, I 100% recommend joining it. I've met so many incredible women in the sports industry and have learned so much from them. So if your campus has Awesome, definitely join it. So back to saying how I got invited to dinner with Hannah Mears. I got to meet her, got to have great conversations with her. And one of the things that Hannah asked me during this dinner was, hey, like, what are your goals for wanting to be a broadcaster, a journalist in sports? And I said, I want to be the journalist that goes out and finds the unique stories about different athletes. I want to tell the stories of athletes that are way beyond their sport. May it be like the mental health part, may it be that some athlete is like super involved in their community. I think like stories like that are so cool and need to be heard, because in today's media, I feel as though that we don't hear those stories enough. We only hear the stories about the star players on the field, on the court, in the pool, wherever it may be. We only hear about those athletes. So I want to find the ones that just have a unique story and be able to share that. So after I told Hannah basically all of that in a shorter version, she suggested, why don't you start a podcast? Like, she's like, you're at an amazing school, you have the resources, you're a student athlete, you have access to a lot of different athletes, you're friends with a lot of different athletes. Why not start up a podcast? So after that conversation with Hannah, it inspired me to start the AGC. And I also have to give a huge shout out to my athletic trainer, Brandon, who has been like my day one since I've been here on campus, in helping me come up with the name. So he does get the name shout out. He came up with the name, the athlete group chat, and I'm very thankful for him and him always believing in me. So here we are now, the AGC, and this is what this podcast is going to be about. And I have so many people like Hannah and my trainer Brandon for inspiring me and encouraging me to actually start this thing. Now I just like want to finish up with the goals of this podcast. Like I've mentioned before, this podcast is going to be a safe place for athletes to tell their stories. I want to have serious conversations, but fun conversations. And I think the biggest thing to know is that this podcast, I want people to know that athletes are more than athletes. Whatever they may be doing on the court, on the field, whatever it may be, they are human too. They are normal too. They have normal lives. They have normal interests, and that their sport isn't everything. So that is a very big emphasis that I want to put on this podcast, that athletes are more than athletes and that everybody has a unique story. So basically, that's it. That's who I am. That's what this podcast is going to be. And I'm very, very, very excited to say that the very first guest on this podcast is going to be my teammate, Ashley Bowen, who is an incredible teammate, incredible person, and just amazes me in all of her hard work with bringing Morgan's message on Penn State campus. Ashley Bowen is a Morgan's Message ambassador. She was the first ambassador for Penn State's campus. So she's going to be the first guest on this podcast. Tell us a little bit about Morgan's Message and tell us why she decided to bring Morgan's Message on Penn State's campus and what it means to her to be the person to start that, because mental health is super, super important for student athletes. So I'm very excited for this next episode with Ashley and for you guys to learn about Morgan's message and hear Ashley's story. So, thank you for listening. This is the AGC, the athlete group chat with Gianna Cutaia. We will be on Instagram, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Thanks for watching, and I hope you all have a great day.